Hello everyone. Tonight we are going on an underwater journey. I will tell you about the history of submarines and how the dream of traveling undersea, which is ancient, became reality. When the first functioning submarines appeared in the 19th century, they were immediately used as warships for the advantages they offered against surface vessels. We will also see how they were used since the American Civil War, and then with always more intensity in World War I, World War II, and after that during the Cold War, all the way to the most modern nuclear submarines that can be autonomous for months. I will also tell you a little about how they work technically, for things like going up and down underwater, how their propulsion works, or the systems that allow people inside to breathe for extended periods of time. We have a lot to discover, so please adopt a comfortable position and just let me do the work. You can close your eyes at any time if you feel like it, and it doesn't matter if you fall asleep. The story will wait for you here. You can navigate between different chapters using the timestamps, and if you wish to listen to my stories on other platforms, for example to keep your screen dark, it is possible. You have links for this in the description and the pinned comment under the video. It is possible on music streaming services like Spotify, Apple Music or Amazon Music, and also on Patreon, where you can listen to everything as podcasts. If you adopt Patreon and become a supporter of this channel, it also gives you other perks, like the possibility to download audios and videos quickly. And you also contribute to keep this channel free of ad breaks for everyone. And now, let's begin our exploration. Before there were submarines, there were diving bells. What is the difference between the two? A diving bell is a chamber that can be lowered underwater and transport people, divers, from the surface to depth and back. But it is not an autonomous vehicle like a submarine. It has no propulsion, and it needs support from people who stay at the surface, on a ship or on the shore. In the antiquity, the project of building submersible diving bells already existed, even though it is uncertain it was ever achieved, based on what we know. Occasionally, of course, divers were used. For example, in the 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago, at the siege of Syracuse in Sicily, the Athenians attacked Syracuse, which was allied to their enemy at the time, Sparta. And during the siege, divers were used to clear obstructions underwater. Almost a century later, it seems Alexander the Great also used divers in sieges. And it is dubious that it actually happened, but later a legend developed that Alexander had descended into the sea during the siege of Tyre in a kind of transparent diving bell made of glass. This anecdote was most probably invented later, because there is no contemporary source indicating the existence of such a diving bell. But it confirms that the concept, the idea or the project was already around in the antiquity. But still, it seems nothing close to a submarine was built back then. For a long time, the antiquity and later the Middle Ages, most people did not think about it as a real possibility or did not take this seriously. But there were always a few inventors trying to figure out how this could be done with the means they had at their disposal. It was clearly very difficult, and for centuries, submarine projects stayed at the stage of plans. Among many issues to create a functioning submarine, a particularly important one was to make it able to dive and then come back to the surface on its own. The only possible way of achieving this seemed to be a system that would let enough water in to make the ship heavier and allow it to dive, and then to return to the surface to expel this water somehow, so that the craft would become lighter and go up. In other terms, a system to adjust its buoyancy was needed. And this is how submarines work, indeed. But before the invention of engines and plenty of other discoveries in chemistry, electricity, materials, this was very difficult to achieve. The first prototypes appeared in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were made of wood and leather to waterproof the craft. They were small and could only dive in rivers. They were not stable enough to sustain waves. Many of these machines didn't work at all. There were accidents. They had very little autonomy and would not dive more than a few feet under the surface. Otherwise, they would not have resisted the pressure. And all these prototypes needed to keep a connection with air at the surface, with a hollow tube that let air in or was used to eject water and resurface. Different ideas were experimented to let water in and out. An idea developed by an Englishman in 1578, William Bourne, was to have flexible leather bags located inside the hull, but open towards the outside, so they could be filled with water to make the craft heavier and dive, and later to resurface. There was a mechanism with a wooden screw, supposedly used manually by the crew. Supposedly because it is unsure a prototype was ever built. We only have plans. So this mechanism pressed on the bags to expel the water outside, and the submarine would go up. The idea looks ingenious, but there doesn't seem to be much space for crew members on the plans, and they would have depended on the small quantity of oxygen inside the hull, unless they stayed connected to the surface by a tube. So in practice, it is unsure this design could ever have worked. Another idea developed by a French physicist, Denis Papin, at the end of the 17th century was to make the submarine out of metal and use a pump to inject compressed air into it or into compartments to raise the inner pressure. When air pressure inside reached the required level, holes were open to let in some water and allow the submarine to dive. And then to return to the surface, compressed air would be used to expel this water. Good idea, and the introduction of a metal hull was certainly a good way of making the submarine viable. But he made 2 prototypes. The first was lost in an accident, and the second would have worked, but not conclusively enough to make him continue this project. What submarines really needed to work were functioning ballast tanks, that is to say, tanks that could be filled and emptied of water, while providing stability to the craft. And the first example, the first working example of such a system, was created and patented in England in 1749. The principles of a craft that would be able to go up and down underwater had been imagined already, but at this point, by the mid-18th century, the limited performances of the materials available and the absence of engines for propulsion and also the lack of interest from navies, because it looked more like an entertaining concept than an usable kind of craft. All of this limited progress and improvements in designs. Submarines stagnated then as very small and barely usable machines for another century. They were essentially a topic of interest for inventors, isolated and seen as a bit eccentric. Independent engineers and inventors continued to imagine and offer prototypes. They were not really useful for deep-sea exploration, for scientific research, because they couldn't dive deeper than a diver. So they were mainly thought of as a possibility for infiltration or the destruction of large warships. For example, in 1800, an American engineer and inventor called Robert Fulton designed a submarine called the Nautilus. It was a metal cylinder, human-powered. There were pedals inside, like on a bike, that transmitted rotation to a propeller. And its originality was that the Nautilus also had a sail that could be deployed for propulsion when on the surface. It was not really made to dive, but rather to float just under the surface and approach warships unnoticed to destroy them with mines. Fulton got enough interest from the French Navy to have a prototype built in France. 1800 was the beginning of Napoleonic Wars, so the idea of developing a cheap weapon that could offset the numerical superiority of the British Royal Navy was very attractive to the French. Tests were made, but they were not conclusive enough. Fulton went on to offer the project to the Royal Navy, that also gave up on it quickly. More isolated projects kept on being designed at the beginning of the 19th century, by inventors who tried to sell them or partner with the navies of different countries, but without success. The limitations remained the same. All of them were human-powered, and this limited their performances. They were very slow. They could not dive more than a few feet underwater. They had very short autonomy, because the air available inside the hull had to be renewed frequently. Unless they worked with a tube, a shaft, connecting them to the surface. But in this case, they became more visible, so they were hard to use. Rather than real submarines, they were more ships that floated underwater. But during this period, 800 to 860, submarines began to adopt the familiar shape of an elongated cylinder, and they were made of metal. This offered new advantages, like for sailing ships. The elongated shape offered better hydrodynamics to travel underwater. And the cylinder was also advantageous to resist water pressure. A circular hull distributes resistance to pressure all around the craft, evenly. So none of these designs became more than plans or a single prototype, but future projects would still build up on the innovations, the ideas that they introduced. The first recorded successful use of a submarine in a war happened during the American Civil War in 1864. Even though submarines were only a marginal part of their war effort, the two sides developed projects and tried to use them. In the North, in the Union, the US Navy built the Alligator after the design of a French engineer. It was a narrow cylinder, 47 feet long and less than 6 feet high, and in that small space inside, there was a crew of 18, most of them affected to propulsion. At first there were 16 hand-powered paddles, like on a galley, and then these paddles were replaced with a hand-cranked propeller at the rear of the submarine. With this system, with the propeller, and a lot of sweat from the crew, the Alligator could reach a speed of 4 knots, which is about 7.5 kilometers per hour, or 5 to 6 miles per hour. 4 knots was not a very good speed at the time in the 1860s. The Alligator was slower than many surface vessels, and these 4 knots could only be achieved with physical effort by the entire crew, so it was available only for a short period of time. For this reason, the Alligator was envisioned as a ship to discreetly lay mines on stationary targets. But even though she had worked in tests, she sank in the Atlantic due to bad weather in April 1863, less than a year after she had entered service, and before it could make any impact on the war. A more successful attempt was made in the South by the Confederacy, with the Hunley, a slightly smaller submarine, about 40 feet long, and also propelled by hand. She was prone to sinking. In total, the Hunley sunk 3 times and was raised and returned to service twice. But these sinkings took the lives of 21 crewmen in total. Nevertheless, in 1864, she managed to attack and sink a medium-sized warship of the US Navy, the Housatonic, during the blockade of Charleston by the Union. The Hunley did not survive this victory, and also sank for the third time after the explosion of the mine she had laid, killing all the crew of 8. But this was the first time ever a surface ship had been sunk by a submarine in real combat conditions, not in a test. The Housatonic displaced 1,200 tons versus just 8 for the Hunley, so she had sunk a ship 150 times heavier. That was a success in this sense, but the fact that she did not survive the raid and sank once again also showed the risks and disadvantages of submarine warfare in the 1860s. So the Confederacy did not replace her. It was 1864 already, and the victory of the Union was approaching fast, and this ended submarine operations in the Civil War. At the same time, the early 1860s, engineers in Europe were working on the introduction of mechanical power instead of human power for propulsion. The development of steam engines that came with the Industrial Revolution now made it conceivable to replicate in submarines the propulsion systems used for ships. The first attempt was made with a submarine called the Plongeur, the Diver, a French submarine in 1863, with a reciprocating engine using compressed air. But in practice, this submarine turned out to be almost unmanageable underwater, at the same time very slow and impossible to maneuver well. A more convincing attempt was made in 1864 by a Spanish engineer with the Ictineo. It was revolutionary back then because it could dive for 2 hours. A problem with steam engines was that they consumed a lot of air. So if they ran on the air inside the hull, the oxygen would quickly be exhausted and the submarine would have to resurface. When propulsion was human, manual, it also quickly exhausted the air. And so the first submarines always had to move for much of the time on the surface, with hatches open, or if not, some kind of tube. This was not only inefficient, because what is the point of having a submarine if it remains visible on the surface? It was also dangerous. A lot of accidents and sinkings were due to this opening that could let water in any time the craft moved on the side or when there were waves. The engine developed for the Ictineo was chemically powered. It did not need additional air to work. And on top of that, the chemical reaction released oxygen, which could be breathed by the crew. This was what allowed divings of 2 hours at a respectable depth of 30 meters, about 100 feet. The design of the Ictineo was significant, very important, because for the first time it achieved air-independent propulsion. For a submarine to be usable, it needs a source of power that does not consume the air inside the hull. It can be powered by a chemical reaction, like in this case, by electricity, with batteries that can be recharged using a combustion engine when it resurfaces, or more recently, nuclear power. But air-independent propulsion is absolutely key. And with this design of the 1860s, submarines really began to be viable for operations in real conditions. There was a second invention in the same decade that began to make them credible as well as war machines: the self-propelled torpedo. It is fine to have a submarine that can go up and down underwater, but how to use it exactly? If it could not project anything, the only way was to approach another ship discreetly, put a mine on it with a time-controlled delay system, and escape. This was generally not practical, except in a blockade situation, because at sea, in real conditions, ships moved, and generally faster than submarines. On top of that, in the years 1860-1870, warships were increasingly becoming armored with iron plates that could be quite efficient at neutralizing an explosion on their hull. So, to become viable, submarines needed a weapon that they could use from a distance, and this weapon would become torpedoes. The first self-propelled torpedo was designed in 1866 by an English engineer, Robert Whitehead. It was propelled by compressed air, and it carried an explosive warhead that could detonate when the head hit an obstacle. It was not very performing yet. It had a speed of just 7 knots, that's 13 kilometers or 8 miles per hour, and for a short time its range was limited to 700 yards, that's 640 meters, but it worked. The first torpedoes were used by surface ships, a new category of small ships, torpedo boats, appeared, and they proved their capacity in real combat in 1878, during a war between Russia and the Ottomans, Turkey, when a Russian torpedo boat sank a Turkish ship. Building on this experience, the basic contours of the modern submarine emerged in the 1870s and 1880s. Modern, which means an air-independent propulsion system, torpedoes for armament, ballast tanks to control buoyancy and dive or return to the surface, and an iron hull that could resist pressure dozens of feet underwater. The designs of the years 1880 were still not very practical compared with what they would become. They needed to resurface regularly to use their main steam engine, and they were made to travel mainly at the surface. Diving was just for attacks or hiding when an enemy ship was in sight, but they worked. Their sizes increased, and their crews diminished now that propulsion was no longer by hand. A relatively successful design of the 1880s was the British Resurgam, which weighed 30 tons. That was 4 times more than the Hunley, this Confederate submarine I told you about before. Elaborating on its design to make it more efficient, heavier submarines were built in the following years, approaching 100 tons. 100 tons for a warship is and already was very small, but it was still a leap forward. And these submarines became credible enough to be sold in small numbers to some navies like the Turkish and Russian navies. But even though they were relatively safe out of combat operations, they still had technical problems that limited them a lot. They were powered by steam engines when at the surface, and this required a lot of coal and limited their autonomy. But it also raised the temperature very high inside the hull, which was uncomfortable for the crew. They were still slower than most surface ships, and when submerged, their maximum speed was about 4 knots. So practically they could not catch up with a moving target. They also needed a long time to dive, and they lacked balance underwater. Something that limited their submergence speed was the chemical engines that replaced the steam engines when they dived. The chemical engine needed time to reach full capacity. It did not provide immediately available energy to power the craft. A source of energy that could be immediately available at full capacity was needed. And it was developed in the 1880s thanks to technical progress in electric battery technology. The first submarines with electric propulsion appeared by the mid-1880s. There were several projects at the same time in Poland, in England, in Russia, in France, in Spain, in America. And the introduction of electricity made them able to dive quickly. Concretely, these submarines had accumulator cells that could be charged with the main engine and that were used when submerged to power the craft. Propulsion and also lighting inside. Light bulbs were becoming more common at the time. Now, even though submarines had gone a long way from the 1850s to the 1880s, they were still looked at with suspicion in the navies of all major powers at the time. They had never been a decisive weapon in any battle, and so many prototypes had sunk before achieving anything that they did not have much to show in terms of achievement. On paper, they had improved dramatically. They were safer. They now had weapons with torpedoes. They had acquired more range, and they had become stable enough to be used at sea and not just in ponds or rivers. But the big priority of navies in the late 19th century was not to invest in a hypothetical submarine warfare. It was to outgun other navies with larger battleships, heavily armored, as fast as possible, and carrying batteries of large, powerful naval guns. A submarine could have merits punctually to fight a blockade or for reconnaissance, but with the small number of torpedoes they could carry and their limited destructive power, a submarine was not believed to be able to sink a modern battleship or even a cruiser. So no navy made significant investment in them until the very end of the century. What made navies change their mind were the last technical evolutions of the 1890s, and especially the replacement of steam engines powered by coal with diesel engines. for the same volume of fuel, a combustion engine was more efficient than with coal, and at the same time, surface warships were also transitioning to oil for their propulsion. At first, submarine designs used gasoline, which gave way to kerosene, and finally diesel. These are all fuels produced by refining oil, but diesel was chosen because it was less flammable and less dangerous. Electric batteries were also generalized. The propulsion of these submarines is called diesel-electric, because they worked on diesel engines on the surface. The diesel engines also recharged electric batteries, and they switched to electricity when submerged. Another innovation was the periscope, a tool to discreetly watch what happens on the surface when the submarine is floating just under it. Torpedoes had also improved and were now faster and could go farther. So, with all these improvements, around 1900, several navies realized that submarines were now to be taken seriously, or that at least it was safer to have some if other navies began to invest in them. In the context of the time, there was an arms race in Europe, on land but also on the seas, and especially a rivalry between the German and British navies, with the German Empire investing in the creation of a large and modern surface fleet. For the first time in a century, this was a challenge to the supremacy of the Royal Navy. So the two were actively modernizing and expanding their fleets, with ever bigger battleships, and other countries also participated in the race: Italy, France, Russia. In this context, all major navies ordered submarines, models that now displaced 100 to 200 tons, that were all equipped with diesel-electric propulsion, and a range of more than 2,000 miles when traveling on the surface, and dozens of miles underwater. More innovations were added in the 1900s. One of them was first built on the models commissioned by the French Navy, the double hull. This means there is one main hull in which the machinery and the crew are placed. This is the pressure hull. And around it, but at a distance, separate by a void that fills with water when submerged, a second hull. This was introduced to make the submarine more resistant to shocks or explosions outside. The outer hull can be damaged or distorted without damaging the pressure hull behind it. And more importantly, the second hull can also be given a more hydrodynamic shape to improve speed or reduce fuel consumption. Another innovation was the mounting of a gun, a deck gun, that could fire when the submarine was on the surface, on top of torpedo tubes to fire underwater. I will tell you about the First World War in a minute, but actually a large part of the damages inflicted to commercial ships during the First World War was with these deck guns rather than torpedoes. The submarines would surface near their targets and shoot at them with the gun, rather than using their precious torpedoes that they carried in limited numbers. Contrary to what we may suppose, the Germans were relatively late in adopting submarines. They commissioned the first ones after 1906, several years after they had already entered service in the US Navy, the Royal Navy or the French Navy. When the First World War began, the Germans had only 20 submarines in service, far from the Royal Navy with 80 or the French Navy with 70. These machines were ready to function, but there was no clear doctrine on any side about how they were going to be used. They were thought of as useful ships for reconnaissance and coastal patrols, maybe to discreetly attack a fleet in a port, but their exact role had not been defined. And even though they had been put in service, the idea of actually using them was considered by many as something dishonorable. For centuries, there had been something special with naval warfare. Ships had names, they thought in formation, they were seen as representing the might and the pride of the nation that used them. There were plenty of rules surrounding the functioning of navies. And this included a code of honor. It was seen as honorable to fight on the surface, but a sneaky stealth attack was seen as vicious and shameful. These kind of considerations would not resist wartime for long. But in the run-up to the First World War, submarines were seen with suspicion as a weapon of the weak. And even though navies did invest in them at the time, they received only a fraction of the attention and the budget that went to large surface ships, especially battleships. Battleships were still seen as the key to naval domination. Interestingly, long before they were engaged on a large scale in a war, submarines had already entered fiction. And maybe the most famous fiction submarine of the 19th century is Nautilus, the submarine belonging to Captain Nemo in the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. What is remarkable with it is that Nautilus included technologies that were only discussed at the time when Verne published his novel in 1870. In the novel, the submarine worked with electricity, precisely sodium-mercury batteries that at the time had not yet been installed on a submarine. It was also double-hulled. I just told you that the first double-hulled submarines appeared in the 1900s, 30 years later. But double hulls were used on surface ships. Verne just had the intuition, or heard, that they could one day be adapted as an envelope for submarines. Nautilus used floatable tanks to adjust buoyancy and control its depth, which was already standard technology at the time. What turned out to be less credible was the way Nautilus attacked ships, by hitting them with a ramming prow to puncture other vessels below their waterline and make them sink. This kind of attack comes from antique ships, galleys, used around the Mediterranean Sea. Obviously, in modern times, ships stopped contact fighting and only fire at each other. It is also unlikely that Nautilus could have resisted the pressure at the depth it traveled with the materials of the time and the kind of large space that is described inside the hull. But still, its description reflected the very last innovations in 1870 and even anticipated on their use in submarines. But we are now approaching 1914 and the start of World War I, the first war when submarines would be employed on a large scale. Why did submarines suddenly emerge as a significant weapon, which was unexpected at the time? First, because naval forces were very asymmetrical. Germany had no possibility to win a frontal surface war on the seas. Despite its efforts in recent years, its fleet was only marginally bigger than the French Navy, and not even half the Royal Navy. And second, because contrary to expectations, the war lasted and turned into a war of attrition and blockade. After the Western Front line stabilized between France and Germany, a long line going from Switzerland to the North Sea. It appeared by the end of 1914 and with clarity in 1915 that the war would not end quickly. No side was able to make a decisive break. The Allies had an edge in a long war because Britain and France had large colonial empires. They had allies and bases around the world, and they could feed themselves and find the raw materials they needed to keep fighting. Germany and Austria-Hungary were in a weaker position economically and industrially. They could develop alternatives to imports of some raw materials. For example, synthetic gunpowder replaced saltpeter, that until then was a crucial component of gunpowder making. But not all raw materials. They produced barely enough food now that millions of men had been called to fight. They lacked necessary fertilizers that were traditionally imported. And so the Allies put in place a blockade that was expected to weaken them until they would capitulate or collapse. The Royal Navy was the main force that put this blockade in place. But the situation of Britain was not perfectly comfortable either. Because Great Britain needed to import food and commodities too. And it could only be by the sea. So in retaliation to the Allied blockade, and to also try to bring Britain to its knees, Germany started using submarines to create its own blockade. It hadn't been thought of as a priority before the war, because the war was expected to be short, but now it was. Submarine production was accelerated dramatically. They were improved to extend their range and increase their firepower. And from 1915, Germany put in place this strategy of deliberately targeting Allied cargo ships in the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean. When it started in 1915, this strategy, called Unrestricted Submarine Warfare, was met with outrage and condemnation. It was seen as dishonorable and barbarian to target civilian ships. Even though the Germans could argue that blocking food imports for their civilian population in order to starve them was not particularly humane neither. Public opinion around the world actually reacted negatively to both blockades, especially in America, where at the start of the war there were sympathies for both sides. But what turned the public opinion against Germany was accidents, blind attacks on ships that shouldn't have been targeted. In April 1915, a Belgian relief ship was torpedoed, and in May 1915, a large liner, the RMS Lusitania. The Lusitania sank in minutes, claiming the lives of 1,200 passengers. A majority of them British and American citizens. The outcry in America was so strong that Germany paused its strategy, but they resumed it later and with no restriction in 1917, this time with more and better submarines. Over the course of the war, the Central Powers, mainly Germany, used 350 submarines called U-boats and lost more than 200 of them. But the cost for the Allies was huge. 5,000 merchant ships were sunk, together with 100 warships. The efficiency of submarines, relative to their cost, was very high, even though the political cost may have been very high too. Without unrestricted submarine warfare, it is uncertain that the US would have helped the Allies so much. So, looking back at what happened, it could be argued that maybe the use of submarines by Germany turned out to be catastrophic in terms of consequences. But militarily, in naval combat and for a blockade strategy, they proved that they could work. As we saw before, these First World War submarines were double-hulled, armed with torpedoes. They could carry 1 to 2 dozens of them, and also deck guns that they often used. They had periscopes and diesel-electric propulsion. Some were built with so much autonomy that they could go as far as the American East Coast to attack ships and back across the Atlantic. But Allied navies also developed countermeasures, and the most important one was the development and the new role attributed to destroyer ships. Destroyers actually existed before the rise of submarines. They were developed in the second half of the 19th century, as a reaction to these torpedo boats that I mentioned earlier. Actually, at the beginning, they were called torpedo boat destroyers. With the appearance of torpedo boats, it was feared that large and very expensive battleships or cruisers could fall prey to a multitude of small torpedo ships that were agile and small enough to approach them and launch their torpedoes. A battleship was made to attack and fight large targets with its huge guns, not small boats. So, on top of installing secondary armament on battleships, that is to say, smaller guns with a high rate of fire to target small ships if needed, escorts were introduced. Smaller and more agile ships that would serve as screens for large capital ships, protect them from torpedoes. These were the destroyers. Torpedo boats declined quickly because they were too small for ocean warfare, and they were effectively neutralized by destroyers. But when submarines became the new threat to larger ships, it was only logical that destroyers were given the function to counter them. But how do you attack a craft that moves underwater? Guns only work when they are on the surface, so this is why a weapon that detonates underwater was needed. And this weapon would be the depth charge. Depth charges are like mines that are dropped and detonate underwater when they hit something, or at a certain depth, water pressure activates a mechanism that makes them explode. Depth charges became the standard response to a submarine attack, with more and more efficiency. Other than that, the Allies put convoys in place. Instead of having cargo ships travel alone, they grouped them, gave them an escort, and this contributed to significantly reduce losses. The peak of submarine warfare was in 1917. In the first month of the year, German U-boats sunk hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping each month, and this was terrifying for Great Britain, because at this rate, the merchant fleet would only survive for a year or two. But the introduction of countermeasures, better and more destroyers, convoys, light guns on merchant ships too, to retaliate when U-boats surfaced to attack them with their deck guns. All of this succeeded at reducing losses. And the threat of starvation or of a drop in industrial production had disappeared by the end of 1917. Finally, in the Great Allied Offensive of 1918 on the Western Front, the German military collapsed and the war came to an end. There were many innovations and changes during the First World War. The rise or the appearance of aviation on battlefields, the first tanks at the end. But at sea, submarines had proven to be a new lethal weapon, and no navy could now ignore them. So, in the 1920s and 1930s, submarines were made in large numbers, but technologically they remained broadly the same, just larger and with a few variants. For example, for reconnaissance, some were fitted with a waterproof hangar containing small seaplanes. They had a steam catapult to launch them, and the plane could do reconnaissance work. Radios were installed systematically for coordination. There were also inventions that were not used yet, but would become common in the Second World War. Like the snorkel. What is the snorkel? A limitation of these diesel-electric submarines was that they could not use their diesel engine underwater, because the engine needed air. So they would most of the time travel on the surface with the diesel engine that also recharged their electric batteries. And only for attacks or to avoid detection did they switch to electric mode and dive. But their autonomy underwater was limited by the batteries. So the snorkel was like a periscope, a tube that could be raised above water when the submarine was submerged, to have access to air, and so use the diesel engine while floating slightly below the surface to avoid detection. The following leap forward in submarine technology happened during the Second World War, which once again pitted the Allies against Germany on the Atlantic Ocean, the main theater of the war for submarines, but not the only one. In the Pacific, in Asia, in the Mediterranean, submarines were employed by both sides to attack cargo ships, and sometimes warships directly. In the Atlantic and the North Sea, the Allies immediately put in place a similar blockade to the one they had used in the First World War, with still the Royal Navy as the main enforcer of this blockade. Strategically speaking, the stakes were the same. For the Allies, isolate Germany and deprive it from raw materials. For the Axis powers, essentially Germany and Italy in Europe, to blockade Britain without surface ships. Except this time, Germany was initially in a better position until 1941. The fall of Poland, then France, had given it more ports and resources. A pact with the Soviet Union guaranteed its imports until Germany broke it and attacked the USSR in 1941. And also the Germans had prepared better for submarine warfare this time, with more modern and more numerous submarines than in the First World War. They would keep producing them until the very end of the war. Britain was as dependent as ever on overseas commerce, and submarines were Germany's best shot at forcing the country out of the war, especially after 1941, when it appeared that massive air attacks had failed to do it, and now that they were engaged against the USSR in the East. The German Navy developed an efficient doctrine of using submarines in packs, coordinated to hunt merchant ships. Until then, submarines were employed as ambushers, lone ambushers. But a single submarine could not do much against a convoy of dozens of cargo ships with an escort of destroyers. Whereas a pack, coordinated by radio, could wreak havoc in it and attack cargo ships while escorters were being distracted, or hunt the same convoy for several days. Sea warfare had also changed since World War I, with new tools for detection and the progress of aviation. At the beginning of the 20th century, ships still essentially relied on visual detection of other ships and their targets. The new technologies that changed that were based on waves, radars and sonars. They used the propagation of sound waves to detect objects at a distance, either passively by listening for the sound made by vessels, or actively by emitting pulses of sounds and listening for echoes. These technologies were installed on warships and submarines during the war, making detection and attack more efficient. And with them came the need for submarines to be as silent as possible when underwater. Their designs were modified to isolate acoustically the noisy parts, like the engines, and limit as much as possible their noise signature. The sonars installed on surface ships, especially destroyers, were also called ASDIC, and they were developed at the very end of the First World War. Too late to be used during it, but they were ready to be generalized during the Second World War. So, what characterizes the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II is the constant escalation, the introduction of new technologies and doctrines on both sides, Axis and Allies, to attack commerce ships and counter these attacks. At the start, Germany had a good period from mid-1940 to early 1941. U-boats sunk hundreds of ships and introduced their pack technique with great success. By the end of 1940, after only a few months, 2 million tons, or 13% of the British merchant fleet, was lost or in repair, which meant that at this rate, the prospects were alarming. The response was to introduce permanent and larger escorts to convoys and put in service many more destroyers. The British benefited from a transfer of American destroyers, even though America still hadn't entered the war, and also support from the Canadian Navy that became experts in escort destroyers and grew dramatically in size all along the war. The Allies had also detected in which zones convoys were likely to be attacked, and they increased their effort to protect these. As a result, losses diminished, and they began to sink U-boats, ending the favorable period for the Germans. So U-boats began to search further west in the Atlantic for targets, and they again found many undefended targets when the US entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The US and Germany were now at war, and in the Atlantic, the Americans had no experience of submarine warfare yet, few destroyers, and so in the first month of 1942, German U-boats attacked successfully a lot of ships without taking a single loss, sometimes just approaching ports at night and firing at the silhouettes of ships that they could clearly see against the city lights on the American East Coast. Over a period of several months, before the Americans completely reorganized, U-boats had a new period of huge success, pushing as far as the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. With British advice and more escort ships, and also the creation of convoys, the Americans finally managed to reduce losses and counterattack against U-boats, which reversed the situation again by mid-1942. Meanwhile, better detection means had been introduced, like for example aircrafts equipped with radars, to localize packs. The battle returned to the center of the Atlantic, and the Germans threw always more U-boats in it. They had developed efficient ways of producing them in large numbers, assembling prefabricated sections. They introduced new torpedoes and made plenty of technical improvements, but despite their efforts, the tide turned in favor of the Allies in 1943 and 1944. The Allies now produced more shipping capacity than the Germans could sink. Most convoys reached Great Britain undamaged, which eliminated the risk of food and material shortages, and so the U-boat threat receded. But it lasted until the very end of the war, and the Germans never renounced. Late in the war, they had started to introduce the Type 21 U-boat, a large and very fast model that could run faster than Allied ships, even submerged. It was never mass-produced, because the Germans had begun to lose bases with the liberation of Europe. In the east, the Soviets were now marching fast, and Nazi Germany was collapsing. But once again, submarine warfare had evolved spectacularly in a few years. Current submarines are the direct descendants from Second World War submarines. They kept evolving during the Cold War and to our days on many fronts: better engines, better materials for performance and discretion, much more electronics, from sonars to operating systems, and they can now stay days or even weeks underwater. They have become so discreet with their stealth technology that a few years ago there was a collision between a British and a French submarine. This happened because none had detected the other, and they accidentally crossed paths. The biggest change of the past 70 years has also been the introduction of nuclear-powered submarines. These are large ships completely free of the need to access air for propulsion, because they are powered with a small nuclear reactor. This gives them an autonomy of months, if not years, the limiting factor becoming food supply for the crew. And the function of submarines has also changed since the Cold War. After World War II, they were never employed again on a large scale in combat. But apart from reconnaissance and the capacity to attack warships, they also became mobile platforms for missiles. They are hard to locate, they can travel all around the world, and they are now part of the dissuasion arsenal of countries with atomic bombs. The US, Russia, and to a lesser extent China, the UK, and France have nuclear submarines that carry nuclear warheads. And for that reason they keep investing heavily in maintaining and improving them. There would be much more to say about submarines, their technology and usage, but this is all for tonight. As always, I hope you liked this introduction, and I'll be back soon with another story. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel like sleeping. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.